And now it allows for much more complex movement because the primitive reflexes only allow for very simplistic movements. And as we said, you can't build a complex brain with simple movements. So we need to get rid of these reflexes to allow the child to now, run and jump and do things and really interact in a much more gross motor, fine motor way that builds a more complex brain. And ultimately then the precursors of cognitive abilities emerge into the brain and grow out. And then once that grows, now we can actually learn.
Now, back to the primitive reflexes. I wasn't too clear as to whether we're to keep or lose them. My understanding is we're supposed to have them up until a certain age, and if we keep some of these reflexes on after, and correct me here, if they continue after, if they persist, then there's signs of developmental delays or there's signs of problem. Can you just clarify as to whether, or at least when, we're supposed to shed these reflexes, if we're supposed to shed them, and what does that mean for the brain development whenever we see these reflexes where we're not supposed to see them, or when they're lacking altogether?
Right. And they're good questions. And this is the questions that really drove a lot of my PhD work. And we published in 2023, I think 8 papers on this. We just came out with another paper about 2 weeks ago in a major pediatric clinical journal, basically looking at retained primitive reflexes as an early biomarker of neurodevelopmental delays like autism. So maybe the earliest and most accurate biomarker. So primitive reflexes or neonatal reflexes are these reflexes that we're all born with. Why do they have them? Why are they so important? Well, as we said, the human brain is very small when we're born. And so the genes that regulate brain development are really what we call experience-dependent genes, and they're really bombarded when we get outside the womb by sensory input. So light, sound, temperature, gravity, all of that, hits the genes and basically turns them on and now gets our brain to grow. But all of that is really driven by movement. A baby needs to move to be able to engage the world, engage their senses, calibrate their brain to the world around them, and build the brain and turn on the genes. The problem is the motor cortex in humans isn't there when we're born. A horse will be able to run in less than 2 hours after being born. We won't walk until 12 months. So in the best case scenario, right? So it just goes to show you how immature, but we don't have control over movement, but yet we need to move to be able to get our brain to grow. This is why these primitive reflexes are so important, because they allow us to do basic programmed, simple movements that allow a baby to do things like root and suck and feed themselves, but also, like I said, get in the right position in the womb, get out of the womb, roll over, and start to move and interact and do things that engage the world in more and more complex ways, building a more and more complex brain. And they should lead us through the first year. And then right around the end of the first year, 11 to 13 months in my window, every child should be able to walk a few steps independently, talk a few words, 3 to 5, and they should point and have good eye contact and smile and have nonverbal communication. And then at that point, the reflexes are gone. They're fully integrated. And now it allows for much more complex movement because the primitive reflexes only allow for very simplistic movements. And as we said, you can't build a complex brain with simple movements. So we need to get rid of these reflexes to allow the child to now, run and jump and do things and really interact in a much more gross motor, fine motor way that builds a more complex brain. And ultimately then the precursors of cognitive abilities emerge into the brain and grow out. And then once that grows, now we can actually learn in a typical way, right? But what we see is that if these reflexes don't come on fully. Like if a baby can't latch on and root and suck, like 90% of the kids we work with non-speaking autism, they couldn't latch on initially. What does that mean? It means the rooting and sucking reflex isn't there. It's not coming out, which means to me that the genes that regulate the gene expression of the brain are delayed, and that epigenetic factors are affecting the expression of those genes, not damaging them, not causing a mutation, but just delaying maybe the onset or the expression of those genes. And the right brain is developing first, so that may be impacted more. But then they start, so then they're not, the reflexes aren't coming on when they're supposed to. They don't hit that milestone, and then they're late for the next milestone. And then they're late for the next milestone, or they may skip over the milestone, and it gets more and more and more and more, and the brain becomes more and more off track. And then what may happen, what I believe happens, and what I think our research has shown, is like something like autism. If the reflexes don't go away by one, then what happens is now the reflexes hold back the brain and they keep it in an immature state. And we've seen this in our research. And then we see these reflexes are retained. If they're there beyond one, they're what's considered retained reflexes, and that is a sign that the brain is still very immature. And then that immaturity can lead to an imbalance, because the right brain should be at its peak of development, but now if it's held back, the right brain should be suppressing that left brain a little bit, but now it loses that. And now if this child is really gifted in their left brain, where they have a trait where their left brain is naturally very strong, it comes online too early, and now it pushes that right brain down, and that's where the regression comes from, I believe. That happens, a lot of it happens right around the time when kids are getting vaccinated. And so, that's where, okay, what do we blame? We're automatically going to blame the vaccine. Although, we do know that, the regulation of the inflammatory and anti-inflammatory system is also in that same brainstem area where all the reflexes come from. So these kids are in a more inflamed state. They usually have what we call a Th2 dominance, which means they're producing antibodies too easily. And now you give them a vaccine that is designed to trigger antibodies, and that triggers inflammation. And now you may trigger, this massive increase in inflammation. And I believe it might be like pouring gasoline on a fire, and it may make that regression even worse. And all of this comes together, I think, in a perfect storm. And that's what I believe is happening.